our fifth talk of the Roski talk of the semester. And I'm really thrilled today to hear from our very own Professor Keith Mayerson, painter, educator, cultural figure extraordinaire. So we're really looking forward to that. Right now, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the series and remind you of some of the upcoming talks before we have our graduate students introduce Keith. My name is Jenny Lin, and I'm Associate Professor of Critical Studies in the Roski School of Art and Design here at USC. And I'm also joined by Anu Vikram, who is teaching our related graduate seminar. Anu will help lead the Q&A after the talk this afternoon. And on behalf of Dean Haven Linkirk of the Roski School of Art and Design, along with Suzanne Lacey, Professor of Art and Chair of the Roski Talk Committee, as well as all of our colleagues in USC's Roski School, I am really thrilled to welcome you here to this afternoon's talk. The Roski Talks are a series that feature some of the most brilliant artists, designers, scholars, curators, and arts professionals working today. And I would like to just briefly let you know about the other fantastic Roski Talks that are coming up this semester. Since you are here, it is likely that you already know how to get in, but just as a reminder, you can access all of the upcoming Roski Talks and other events and register for them by visiting roski.usc.edu/events. And following this week's talk, we have a talk next week by Carmen Winnett, who will be giving the Hatman Photography Lecture on March 3rd, followed by TJ Drew Norris, who is an artist that will be visiting us on March 10th. Then we will have designer Karen Fung coming to us on March 11th at 6 p.m., followed by artist Diedrich Brackens, who will be coming on March 17th. And then our very own Amelia Jones, scholar and curator, coming on March 31st, followed by Gabriela Urtiaga, curator at MOLA, coming on April 14th. And last but not least, Simon Leung, artist and professor at UC Irvine, that will be joining us April 21st. So all of those talks are at this time on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. unless otherwise noted. And we hope to see you at some of those future ones as well. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our fabulous first year MFA student, Lainey Rocca, who will be introducing Keith today, and Francesca Flores. Hi, Francesca. Yes. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you, Jenny. Yes. So hello all, and thank you for joining us. Like Jenny said, we have our own very Keith Mayerson joining us. So just a little background about Keith. Keith Mayerson is an American painter from Cincinnati, Ohio, who depicts moments of American history, iconic figures, and personal spaces. He studied semiotics and studio art at Brown University and received an MFA from UC Irvine. Mayerson is a professor of art and the chair of painting, drawing, and printmaking at USC Roski. Influenced by theater and performance, he selects subjects that carry notable stories and uses impressionist techniques to create paintings that take on movement and a life of their own. When painting, Mayerson sets an environment for himself by listening to music and audiobooks to evoke a deeper questioning of his painting's process and methods. An avid reader of comics, Mayerson draws from the composition and structure of storytelling and comics to consider how his pieces can speak to one another and generate closure from content with the audience. So, excuse me. So many of his pieces can be seen at the permanent collections of the Whitney, LACMA, MoMA, and more. So to take it away, Keith, we would like to begin discussing with us. Am I on mute? Oh, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you guys so much. And I'm so proud and pleased to be here, really. It's really my honor. And I love teaching at USC. I wish I could teach even more with the grads, but I'm now the chair of painting, drawing, and printmaking at USC Roski. And I've had over a 25-year-long career, you guys, and so I have a lot of images to go through, and so kind of like what I like to do is just sort of zoom through them, so to speak, and do an overview kind of scan, and then please, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and those guys will record them, and we could get to them at the end, but I'm going to try to barrel through and finish this within 55 minutes. Starting here, this is Pinocchio the Big Fat. This is in my 1993 thesis show that was at the UC, at UC Irvine, where I was an undergraduate at Brown, and I studied studio art and semiotics. And I was always the comics kid on campus. And I also studied, I loved fine art. I didn't really know how to do it and what it was about. And I was coming out as an individual in my own life, but I also want to come out obviously ideologically and intellectually. At UCI at the time was a matriarchy led by Catherine Lord, and a lot of the people who were in the 1993 Whitney Biennial, the famous Goldman Park curated one that was about gender identity politics. But one of my teachers, Larry Pittman, said he wants art that invites you to think for yourself rather than tell you what to think, even though he was in the 93 Biennial. I don't necessarily agree that all the art in that biennial was like that. But I realized with this series, I was able to marry all my comic acumen and cartoons with my playwriting experience. I wrote and directed plays when I was at Brown, and also fine art. And I used as a framing device Pinocchio, of course, who comes into his own by learning ideas of language to find his own agency. But here he comes into to his own by learning who he is emotionally, sexually, and also intellectually. And I cast as people in this John Wayne as Geppetto, here Montgomery Clift, this particular characters. Jodie Foster was the Blue Fairy, and Keanu, who is just sort of coming out, so to speak, with My Own Private Idaho, was Lampwick, the laziest boy in school, as mentioned here. And the conceit was that my version of Pinocchio, and I wrote a whole sort of bad Cole Porter musical to go along with this, existed throughout the entire time that the C. Collodi original appeared, and that it would be as if there are all these different children's books that existed through time that some gay collector or something would have collected all the images from and put together. And so hopefully the history is there in terms of what this could mean. Also, ACT UP was still very much part of this. I'm here, I'm queer, I'm fabulous. And it really helped me intellectually and emotionally on my journey of coming out. I met my husband now, Andrew. We've been together 29 years at UC Irvine. This was my thesis show that traveled. One of my teachers introduced it to this guy, Rick Jacobson, who brought it to this wonderful Seminole Gallery, Kiki in San Francisco. Annie Philbin saw it there and brought it to the Drawing Center in New York. I got an Art Forum's openings review. It was really my breakout show. I was so pleased and proud, and was able to instantly, back in 1994, show at Richard Tejas in Los Angeles and have a gallery. But this is sort of to give you an idea of what it looked like installed at the original UCI home. But then when I had my next show, I decided I'm one of those artists, if it becomes too successful, I think it might be too easy and I want to trip it up. And so for my next show, I had 7 different narratives all mixed together, and it was up to the viewer to provide the closure of the content between any particular one, to really talk about what it was to come out during this time where AIDS was still really roaring and prevalent, and people are still kind of coming into consciousness of what gay identity could be, and a new queer identity, a new kind of homocore identity that I really felt affiliation with. River Phoenix had just died, and this is a series where River Phoenix is abducted by blue meanies and saved by sort of a teddy boy John Lennon, done in the style of Yellow Submarine on metal, inspired by Peter Max and those people. This was a series of Keanu sightings. Again, this was before Speed, before The Matrix, before he was super popular. And I would hear stories how people would meet up with him, or in this case, an actor friend said, oh, I need a place to stay. And he said, oh, you could like hook up with me in my room at the Chateau Marmont. And I don't know if he's gay or Hollywood bisexual or whatever Keanu is, but the idea here was that it would be like some old New Yorker artist would like hang out in plein air doing a drawing, waiting for Keanu to come by, and I would record all that there. This is the poet Arthur Rimbaud as the character Maldoror. In the story that was written concurrently, Les Chants du Maldoror by Le Comte de Lautremont, a visionary romantic French vampire story, as drawn by his then older lover Paul Verlaine in the style of Odeon Raydon. So a lot of postmodern kind of like references there, but in order to laugh way before the Joker to smile, he cut his mouth with a knife. This was mixed in with these pet paintings, and these were collected by a friend who had a friend who worked at a photomat, who would double all the photos of people's pets that he loved for their uncanny ability to harness like emotions that he was feeling at the time. He unfortunately, sadly died of AIDS. But I was able to borrow these photos and thinking about the ideas of sort of funny animal genre, anthropomorphized animals like Snoopy, being able to personify anybody, no matter who you are, what ethnicity, color, gender, orientation you are. Maybe when you see Snoopy, you could become Snoopy. But for me, I was sort of fueling my anguish and anxiety about not just being gay, but being gay in the age of AIDS through these pet paintings. Mixed in with that was a narrative of Archie from Archie Andrews in Archie Comics, falling in love with Reggie, who wasn't necessarily gay, being abducted by aliens, and finding out that he himself was like normal and everybody else was an alien. And I always think that Archie kind of looked like Tintin comics done by Hergé, which kind of looked like Hergé, Japanese woodblock prints. Also, Henry Darger was really in at that moment. So this is sort of like Archie by way of Hergé, by way of Hergé, by way of Henry Darger, done in sort of on this rice paper, kind of like East Asian painting. These were photos I found in the basement somewhere at a gay bookstore of a guy who spliced himself in, masturbating, sorry, but they remind me of Pierre Monnier, and it felt sort of this lonely, weird, erotic world with a guy having fun with himself through the vehicle of photography. These were images based on a hustler's narrative from this old weird, sad porn tape, where he talks about his life before he's then kind of raped unsafely by this troll-like character. Anyway, his favorite actor, ironically, was Kirk Cameron, who's, born again Christian. And so just to take you through this, I would put the quotes from Maldoror in French to kind of purposely obfuscate the narrative for people to think more. Here's River getting abducted by the Blue Meanies. Here's a pet painting. Here's a Keanu sighting from Agnes B in Beverly Hills. Here, River and John are falling through the sea of holes. There were a lot of art quotes in this. This is a quote from Larry Poon's painting. It says complimentary there for the towels, for complimentary colors. This was actually, the hustler said he was bad at sports, and so was I when I was a kid. And this is a portrait of me holding a soccer ball when I was haplessly trying to play soccer as a kid. Here are the Blue Meanies raging terror against these gay men, again in a time where AIDS was really, really bad. Here, I was surprised and happy that I was able to incorporate, I think, 7 different narratives where Archie comes in to hang out with Reggie, but then sees that he's with another woman, and then tries his own fare with him and rejected by Reggie. And then there's aliens and the whole 9 yards. Another pet painting. Here's where Archie realizes that he's a really good person and everybody else is kind of an alien going through therapy. I always like happy endings, so to speak, and this was the happy ending for the Yellow Submarine, where all you need is love, love, love. And this show was interesting. It was successful. There's like 110 pieces, but the one thing that I liked about this show the most as a painter was the pet paintings. I was reading the first John Richardson biographies of Picasso at the time, and I realized that, like, oh my gosh, like Picasso, rather than starting any kind of art-directed narratives, quoting ideas of postmodernity and theory and stuff like that, if you want to make a Cubist painting, he would make a Cubist painting one day. If you want to paint a still life, he would paint a still life one day. And it was up to him to sort of art direct himself and work intuitively. And I felt like, gosh, why am I doing all these different layers of meaning? What am I doing with all these layers of references? Can I get to the core of who I am, whatever the signature might be in terms of my own mark making, and use these pets, which seem like really good avatars for me to project myself into in the meditation and making work. And I do believe and still teach comics. I'm starting a whole narrative art program at USC. And I like part of the meditation and making comics where you sort of suture into the avatar of your character, you become them, kind of like when you're drawing a character and the character's smiling and you're smiling too, you know that you're rendering really well. And maybe these pets were good vehicles for that. And so I made them bigger. That first one of the poodle ended up at LACMA. A few of these ended up in really good places, one at SF MoMA. But I love the idea that I could just sort of suture into the vehicle of the character, become the character, feel what the pet is feeling, or at least what I'm projecting that pet is feeling, and have fun painting. In the meantime, my husband got into grad school in New York, and I lived in New York before coming to UCI, before moving to LA. And I decided I would go, of course, with him to New York. And I was driving our Daihatsu filled with stuff, listening to the Beach Boys going cross country. And the Beach Boys are amazing, and Brian Wilson especially so. And one of the things I realized when he was singing his song from Pet Sounds that goes, and a baby cried, like that, where in the semiotics of that, he was turning the word cry into like a baby-like wail, and he was able to fuse signifier and signified. Why can't I do that with my art too? Like, why, again, am I working through all these different avatars, all these different vehicles? Why am I having to always quote postmodern ideas? Like, what would happen if I worked like a modernist and did a law of automatic drawing, a law of automatic painting? What would happen? So when I got to Williamsburg, I started just sketching out ideas. This was back in the early 90s still, when Williamsburg was kind of sketchy, and we were really worried about crime and stuff like that. And so I just did like this police robot man, or these circle paintings. I love Van Gogh and his lights and his stars and circles. They say like crazy people do circles. Hopefully I'm not crazy, but I was wondering about that. What's the cyclical atmosphere of doing a circle painting? And how can you create an energy to a painting, just kind of like batteries are wired and coiled together to create their own energy? But it was a little too early for me to come out with these sort of abstract paintings I called iconscapes, because I believe, kind of like when we dream, maybe the power of cartoons is that we see these sort of iconic, essentialized kind of figures, and we project onto them like, oh, that's grandpa, or like, what are the icons projected from your subconscious? How do they permeate pictures in general? But coming from the automatic drawing and painting, I did my next show at Richard Tejas in LA called Monty's Dream, The Sleeper in the Valley, where I try to incorporate some of these ideas, but still do sort of figurative elements. These are big paintings for me, 5x7, so they're kind of like a little movie screen. And I decided, going through the automatic drawings I was doing, to try to come up with sort of a panorama of life or the world. And so like this would be early childhood, where I have like this character that looks like the Simon electronic game from my childhood, and like an R2D2 type character. This was early adolescence with the FU flag and the have a nice day dude saying everything sucks, go to effing hell. And like sort of rambling visually and trying to make my own sort of metonymic unconscious associations. Again, this is still a time where I had friends who were dying of AIDS. And it was like a pretty intense time to be a young gay man in New York, and having weird dreams and trying to get them out on paper and then on canvas. This was sort of, later life, or like if we're thinking like biblically about the earth, it could be sort of an apocalypse where the sheep are going off into heaven and skeletons are rampaging the earth. And then here we are, aliens taking care of whatever people like sheep were left on the planet. And then the lonely space ark in space with a Death Star looking wantonly upon the space ark, feeling its thoughts. This was kind of a radical, weird painting at the time. Like to do, at the time, art and fashion was really in. Paintings that had to look like photos were really in. John Curran, Lucia Scapes were kind of emerging, who had like a really set looking style. And I was really, though, looking, earlier than that, thinking about Forrest Best and Martin Hartley, really trying to get to the core of the engine that made, hopefully, paintings that had a life of their own, that could go whoopee, whoopee, woo, or push and then pull. These circle paintings actually did pretty well. They were at Luring Augustine. There are other blue chip galleries. And I was able to get a solo show at Jay Gorney on Green Street at the time, where Kathy Opie, who was my friend who ran the Cage, believe it or not, at UCI back in the early 90s, worked and showed her work. And Larry Pittman, my great teacher, also showed. And for here, like instead of doing a specific narrative, I thought like maybe the narrative is my life, and I could put these abstract iconscapes next to figurative paintings, and hopefully the figurative paintings would fall apart in abstraction, and the abstract paintings would come together as figurization, and maybe that could be allegory for my time. I mean, I'm a spiritual person, not necessarily religious. I was trying to get into Catholicism or understand it by listening to Jesus Christ Superstar, the musical. Sorry, I'm kidding. In the basement of our Christopher Street apartment, and the electricians came in, and this painting fell on on my palette. I was like, oh my gosh, Eureka, because Jesus was stoned to death, and so was this painting with like these little drops. Also, but that would be next to a picture like this, which I really figure was sort of almost religious, almost like a character that could have a halo. I still today even look at Fra Angelica paintings and so on, and they have this mysterious undercurrent that's very spiritual, of course, of abstraction. And then they put sort of the face of Jesus or angels or saints upon that for people to recognize what the story might be about. But the religiosity, the spirit is really there, the verb, the abstraction behind it. Trying to get to that kind of idea. This is Laurence Olivier as Hamlet. And again, like I really liked how it was sort of breaking apart. I was also starting to think of these characters of real life human beings like Laurence Olivier, who was gay or at least Hollywood bisexual, playing Hamlet, which obviously has so much poetic resonance for the time. Next to something like this, this is a iconscape. And I was teaching comics at this time in Scott McCloud, and he talks about essentializing characters and figures and faces like Charlie Brown or Snoopy, or again, the Have a Nice Day Jude, so people could relate to them. And I was thinking, when you're looking at images, if we're always looking for faces in clouds and faces just to survive, how can I make a picture that could be dynamic? Again, in a postmodern world that said that paintings couldn't be like this. But how can I make this sort of this engine where I would have a face inside of a face or a head shape inside of a face shape with sort of this centrifugal force of all the colors undulating in different ways. And so when you look at this painting, trying to see a face in it, all of a sudden it starts moving and vibrating, along with the synesthetic effects of the feelings that I wanted to project into this picture. I had that next to something like this, where I felt like hopefully you could grab, that little ball in the interior of it and pull it out. Next to Laurence Olivier's Henry V. This is another Jesus Christ Superstar painting. And on this one, I was allowing my subconscious to sort of riff with the reality of what I was projecting. I really do think that's an advantage of a painter, is that you're consciously projecting what it is that is your thoughts into an image, but your unconscious is also driving it. I realized that later there was like this sort of weird like bird form in the middle of it, and thinking about Raphael and the goldfinch and how that was an indication supposedly of Christ's passion, and how that just kind of appeared. Next to this painting where hopefully that circle was sort of hovering like an axle between two wheels of these other circles, but like with a little teardrop of a paint smear at the bottom, almost like a crying giant eye. Next to this painting of Frankenstein, and I definitely identified with the idea of Frankenstein, the Mary Shelley version, the very sentient Frankenstein. He feels abject because he doesn't fit into the patriarchal order of the time. And the John Whale Frankenstein monster, James Whale, a British gay out man who went through World War II, thinking of Frankenstein not so much as a monster, but as an anti-hero. I'm putting it next to this picture of Keanu from Point Break. And so it was sort of like Keanu was like sort of shooting at Frankenstein. I do think of myself as an installation artist who works with images. I really carry that through even today, where instead of doing comics on a page, each panel is like a panel in a comic, and how they're juxtaposed on the wall tells, in my case here, a very non-linear narrative. And it's up to the viewer to create the closure or the content when they see one painting next to another. This was iconscape that I really liked, because all of a sudden, like, these figures were really emerging without any mediation of myself. I love like the James Ensor painting of St. Anthony at the MoMA, where he was able to sort of illustrate the things that were kind of conjured up in his abstractions. But I didn't want to illustrate them like that, or like Salvador Dali, but I wanted to bring out in a more optical space than, say, somebody like Arshile Gorky, whose paintings and drawings seem a little dry. Like, how can I make a Renaissance-like space out of the optical field of oil painting? This is a picture of porn star at the time, Johann Pollock, who also kind of worked as an avatar for this This is another quote from the Henry V, the movie directed by Olivier, of Castles in the Sky, Ships at Sea, Yearning for a Better Future, Still in the Time of AIDS. This is Montgomery Clift from Red River. Monty Clift was an out gay man, sadly at his time, a bitter alcoholic. He had a car crash, it was really bad. But this, he's playing a soldier from his side, and I liked in the dreamlike way that I was rendering this, that all of a sudden a horse appeared, and it kind of reminded me of like the Caravaggio painting of the saint being kicked by the horse. Downstairs, I had unframed the drawings of here that, you know, I had become known from the Pinocchio series a little bit, and sort of those tight rendered drawings that were really referencing things. But here again, like I was sort of doing sort of unconscious and consciously derived drawings. This is a drawing about dying. This actually looks like, this was supposed to be Montgomery Clift, but if you look at it a different way, if you squint your eyes, it's a little bit like a, you know, death, the figure of death with his giant sword. This is Mike Myers from Halloween, 3 different versions of him. I don't like horror movies in particular, but I like the beginning of Halloween, where you see this forlorn kid in the sprawling suburbia of his youth, feeling lost. This show was really weird. Like, people really loved it or they hated it. And I always think when you do a really good show, sometimes it's like that. It creates waves, and people really remember it. Like, I'm friends with people like Amy Silman and Dana Schutz, because like they saw that show and it in a wonderful way freaked them out, because nobody was doing quite these painterly paintings downtown. Uptown, there was Ham Soutine, there was Nicholas de Stael, and so on, and things that I was thinking about, Forrest Best, Marston Hartley, but downtown, none of that. But, you know, the show did well enough that I did get some acclaim and some insider acclaim, and people still remember the show. A wonderful curator named Klaus Curtis decided to curate me in the Mary Boone Gallery with these paintings, more iconscapes, and this was the Apocalypse of the Horseman, which sort of death, life. I was listening, and oftentimes soundtracks are really important to me. I was listening like Joy Division for the negative ones, like religious and spiritual music for these more sort of heavenly ones, more kind of, you know, intense, you know, metal and punk rock for the negative one, more sort of a in-between for the positive one. Well, people like this work, you know, they realize, oh, it's like Kandinsky. It's like the modernists. But this was back in 1998 or something. And again, like art and fashion was in, and you know, I always felt like the thing about that, if it was a movement, it could be like, if somebody really liked your painting, like they would like a Prada coat, maybe they would buy it, and then after it went out of fashion, they could sort of put it in the back of their closet. I really wanted to make work that was really questioning things, questioning what painting could be and drawing, really trying to get to the core of, you know, can a painting be a window into the other world? I am a son of a psychoanalyst proudly, and I really do believe in the ideas of the unconscious and trying to make sort of dreams palatable, the ineffable. And I think like some of those things at that time by Roland Barthes and others were really talked about, like what can you not put into language? What can you not put into words? How can that be the verb of a painting? And trying to get that through. We lived on 46th Street at the time. It was super sad. I was doing these paintings. I was sort of misunderstood. I was only about 30 years old. It was 1999. But we moved into this place on 46th Street, and it seemed like a really good deal. It was $1,400 square dollars for 1,400 square feet. And you know, there were like holes in the ceiling, and people thought we were crazy, but we knew that we could do it. But then we were moving some stuff for the floor people, and something fell on our poodle puppy and killed her, which was so sad, the first day that we moved in. And then we came back, and the mob was opening up a bordello underneath us, and which like really sickened us. I mean, we're pro sex worker, all that kind of stuff, but really hearing this dynamic disco music late into the night, seeing these haggard, sad women come in to get exploited by the mob was horrible. And the police were in on it. Andrew, my husband, got super depressed. We decided that we would move out. And, you know, again, like I had this sort of Holding Caulfield moment of like, the art world, is it all just about rich white people? Like, that's not the audience that I really want to talk to. And I had this sort of Holding Caulfield Mendasky moment with the art world. Even though I was doing pretty well, I took all my work out of all the galleries. I thought I was going to retire early, like Arthur Rimbaud, or, painting the provinces like some of my heroes like Cézanne. And we moved to Andrew's family's little cabin near Lake Elsinore in Riverside, if you know where that is, near Murrieta. And it's like a lot of trailers and tractors and crystal meth labs and CC Top, dusty old white people who are weird, but we really liked it. And, I just painted plein air. And I thought like I would just do it for the integrity of, making paintings for the right reasons. Doing these sort of abstract iconscapes, kind of like Joan Mitchell, projecting onto the landscape and feeling my thoughts. And painting, we raised, chickens and roosters and geese and our German shepherds. I was teaching at UCI at the time though, which was great. But I realized after a year of doing this that those people at Walmart really knew what we were about. Like they probably club us. Proposition 8 was happening, anti-gay marriage stuff was happening. It got a little weird. I felt a little marginalized. I thought, you know what, I better grow up and, get with this. If I was wired to do art and instead of comics, I really love painting and I did love the really core group of the art world. Maybe I should just go back to New York with my tail between my legs and start over. And so I was teaching at NYU. I started teaching comics at SVA again. And in my little apartment where I was trying to forge a place for Andrew and I started building a whole series of paintings. This is Rimbaud next to an abstract iconscape. This is Michelangelo, a quote from the Pieta. Bush W had just gotten into office, and I decided this would be a series called Hamlet 1999. It was post 1999 at that time, but I felt like, I love the idea of Hamlet questioning authority, being disillusioned, being kind of like homoerotic with his friends Horatio, who here was played by River Phoenix, otherwise, by Ashitaka from the Miyazaki movie, Princess Mononoke playing Hamlet. That would be casting again characters in my version of Hamlet that I'd written when I was in California and build this whole salon style. So let this be a lesson to you. Don't be disillusioned by the art world. The really core people of the art world, the great gallerists, the great collectors, the great curators are in it for the right reasons. They just want to push the discourse along in the way that people believe. It's not about flip art. It's not about ka-ching or trophies. It's really about, thinking aesthetically. And when you pull yourself off the map of the art world, people realize how egregious that could be. It took me a while to get, back in. Like it took 6 years of people, and I didn't go around with my begging bowl, but it took 6 years to get another show where basically I was able to transport all the work that I had salon styled in our little apartment into the Derek Eller Gallery and have my Hamlet 1999 show. The other thing that I did here, which is kind of funny, is you aren't supposed to give more supply than there is demand, but I was like, F it. I'm just going to put my whole narrative, put it all out there, just go for it to get the idea, the cosmology of the story, the narrative that would have a first and a second and a third act and put it all in. And so here, James Dean, who really was gay, who was sugar daddied into Hollywood, is playing Hamlet. I was painting much looser at that time. This was sort of Claudius by way of Westworld, thinking about George W. Bush being like a giant robot of the corporate machine with these sort of robotic elements allowing for the unconscious to spill through. John Kerry was actually vying to be president. I did the Superman picture, not consciously thinking of him, but sort of looks like John Kerry from the original newspaper strip. Again, Arthur Rimbaud as Hamlet, Spider-Man as Hamlet. 9/11 had just happened. I witnessed it with my husband. We were living in Soho at the time. I was teaching at NYU. It was really super intense. My dad was in town and he saved papers for me to paint it, but I was like, no, Dad, I can't paint this. I wouldn't want to exploit this moment, but I would have nightmares. And to get rid of the nightmares, I would paint allegorically. So here's like Spider-Man trying to save people, but being, wrestling with the arms of Doc Ock. But still, to me, it sort of breaks down the subconscious sort of icons of like people in the left-hand corner, almost like people on the plane that crashed into the 9/11. Or here, sort of the buddy robot gorilla thinking about humans being like animals that are being subjugated and suppressed by the corporate commodity culture like a machine, but here kind of also wanting the idea that it sort of breaks into this sort of surreal abstractions of a dream or a nightmare. Spider-Man on the roof trying to save Jimmy Stewart falling in Vertigo, like the people fell the buildings. Another quote from King Kong from the 70s version that was obviously shot at the World Trade Center, really projecting my feelings towards that whole event, which still resonates with me. Wanting to save people, kind of like the ghost in Hamlet, here played by John Lennon. River Phoenix, a great Horatio type figure who had also sadly died, next to James Dean, another hero. I'm still a Keanu fan, sorry, but Matrix came out and I really thought that that was such an awesome character and an awesome narrative that was really allegorical for that time and still now, sort of putting a halt to the bullets. This was one of the first paintings I did when I came back to New York of Lincoln Remembers. Andrew was still at the cabin and I was trying to get a place for him in New York and thinking about that time. And obviously Lincoln was probably gay and a good Republican in office. This was Harry Potter, sort of a young Hamlet. This was I had this nightmare of the skull going down these stairs for all of my childhood. And I finally saw Phantom of the Opera, the original Lon Chaney version. And there's this famous colorized sequence where that actually happens. I realized that nightmare was from a movie. And so when you get back to the source, thinking about Claudius and Hamlet painting the Phantom. And this is Harry Potter going hopefully to a better place. And it was ironic too, because we had lived in Lake Elsinore and Hamlet was from Elsinore. This is from my own photo. This is a Madonna that was outside on Howson Street between Prince and Sullivan outside this church that I would say a little non-denominational prayer for every time I walk my dog. And then here again is Olivier's Hamlet, really sort of synthesizing the feelings that I was thinking at the time. Bush seems like a puppy dog compared to Trump these days. But at the time, it was really heinous. We were getting in all these horrible wars. This is one of the last of the Beatles live concerts. And I wanted this to be kind of like a Rothko, but then up, or like the Beatles, kind of playing music, like people kind of going to the camps. When I was feeling very dour at that time with the abstraction, the iconscape helping illuminate that. Christ as the ultimate ghost from the original Michelangelo sculpture. Act on comics. And, again, like I really think of my fine art shows acting on the vehicle and the structure of comics. First, the very first Superman. And I felt like if Washington was alive to see what was being done in his name, he would never stop crying. And, it ended as sort of at the end of the world. Luckily, that show did well, though. It was sort of a good comeback show. Roberta Smith wrote about it in the New York Times. People started thinking about my work again, which is really good. And kind of like those pet paintings, I decided, this is a really good idea to speak through the vehicle of the iconic character. If it wasn't Snoopy, speaking through characters that meant a lot to the world. I love Elvis, I'm sorry. I realize he's a joke and he was a fat joke growing up, but he was a character that really changed culture through his music. Yes, there was colonization. Yes, there's bad politics about it. But I was also really interested in who are these people who are artists in cultural worlds that are really helping to change the world to make it a better place. I'm a big believer in Joseph Campbell and his ideas as an artist's job is to tell stories for a culture to understand itself in order for that culture to progress. James Dean was definitely one of those people that helped create a voice for the youth generation. For the heretofore never had happened. He helped to, in some ways, create rock and roll because John Lennon and Elvis were both super inspired by James Dean. Again, a gay man bringing different kinds of sensibility and sensitive masculinity to the world. Montgomery Clift, same thing. I was listening a lot to Marvin Gaye at this time and jazz and wanting to sort of to break apart into iconic abstraction. And here's the man himself, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On? Still an album that super resonates, so political, so of its moment. It's so musical and transcendent and beautiful. You can listen to it again and again and again. You can understand what it's about from the lyrics, which are allegorical for now, but the music really moves you, which is what I hope to do in my pictures. This is Captain Kangaroo. I was collecting these images from a thrift store out here of this costume character actor, and I felt like, to get into heaven, if you believe it, you can't follow Mammon, and here's the dancing bear trying to get into heaven with gold, or Goldilocks as his book, but it's falling away. This is from this train set that we would collect, thinking about ideas of technology, maybe not getting us further. This was Andy Williams Meets the Alien, another one of those costume characters. George Harrison and John Lennon, you never see them, they're always in the same picture. Of course, they're the first two Beatles that died. And thinking about Picasso, but also thinking sort of these heavenly realms that you could maybe touch with the hand of the painter's brush. This is, again, during the time of Iraq, and I was listening to Air America, and people really, protesting that war that we got into over oil. I love oil paint. This is Gusher from another James Dean painting. But again, obviously, the need for oil, the lust for oil has gotten into so much trouble, like it did with James Dean with his car crash. I realized at this time, too, when I was appropriating from images that had the historical value of James Dean dying from his car crash, feel sad for Tiger Woods right now. But that there was a lot of stuff in those photos that you could cull from, that you could, I'm not a Hollywood medium or anything, but that you could channel things and see things. And there's different things that are happening in those photos. And maybe if I could sort of arrest time and look at those images, maybe I could see something. I started seeing like different sort of saints and different kinds of things in this work, and also loving Van Gogh and so on. Judy Garland, sadly, Andrew's best friend Alicia had died of AIDS. She was a wonderful person, but kind of wild. And she came down with pneumonia, and a week later she had passed on. This whole show, Rebel Angels at the End of the World, and thinking about her, speaking allegorically, and also thinking about, Susan Sheehan in Air America and her, mourning the loss for her son standing outside of Bush's compound. And Hurricane Katrina also happened. And I was thinking about, nature overcoming man and humankind's egregious exploitation of the earth, and which is obviously still happening now, maybe depicted by King Kong. This is a show in Brussels called Heroes. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster because this is 2006. Judy Garland, but trying to think about the old masters. We got to go to Europe. I was looking at Caravaggio. I was looking at Rembrandt, realizing in micromanaged moments of those great masters how much weird unconscious stuff came through, can make a monumental painting. And, thinking about Warhol, who, was a little aspy and a little not touchy-feely, not that that's a bad thing. But wanting to bring a warmth and a feeling of a Rembrandt to pop iconographic figures of people like Jackie, people like he had been painting, but really to bring the emotional moment back to that history painting of JFK. And, this was my childhood, thinking about all these characters, growing up, idolizing them and having them influence my own life. People like Jimi Hendrix with, again, great music that you can listen to the end of time, with wonderful psychedelic lyrics that actually had allegorical resonance. This was a show in Brussels, and loving comics, still Tintin, and wanting to project my own identity into this famous kind of homosocial character, along with Bugs Bunny, kind of a queer American cartoon. In Errol Flynn, who was also Hollywood bisexual, a huge hero in his time, playing Robin Hood, which also has its allegorical resonance. This was a show called Kings and Queens. This was in 2006 at Derek Eller. And, at this point, I think I'm trying to get more and more into the power of the painting itself. I'm thinking about Proust. I don't know if you guys have read his 1,000-page tome, Remembrance of Things Past, but it starts out when he bites into a Madeleine, those little French cookies, and it sends him into a reverie of his youth. And it brings about that whole fantastic novel. And he has this moment in that where a painting critic sees a Vermeer painting and he falls to his death in sublime reverie. So I was listening to the Remembrance of Things Past on audio CD and doing this work. I was also kind of thinking of like Seraphim Angels. This is a quote from Michelangelo's The Last Judgment, to scale of the Christ in the center of it. But, these people died like River. Would they be, if heaven really exists, around GOD because of what they brought to culture and how they improved upon it? Also thinking about like king planets, like planet Jupiter, which is like the gaseous planet, hopefully not what Earth will turn into with our reliance on gas. Again, James Dean, sort of like the end of the world. This almost looks like a mecha from an anime, from the scene where he turns around and tells Salminio, who was also gay and sort of a gay boyfriend substitute in the movie, it's okay, you can come out now. Another Elvis moment. This is the first time he performed publicly, when everybody went wild and they realized like, oh my gosh, this is new, something's happening. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington at the Lincoln Memorial. And this is right around the time that, Obama is starting to come into the fore and really thinking about like truth and justice coming back to Washington, just like Jimmy Stewart and Mr. Smith wanted it to happen. Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, obviously really meaningful to me as is, world culture and wanting to, think of ideas of history painting people who are really powerful, who were, not just straight white guys, but like women and people of color. Here, like Eleanor Roosevelt, who was probably a lesbian, who had such political agency at her time that JFK had to get her approval in order to run for president. Here, he had just gotten that. They're very happy. The Beatles, one of their last public appearances, this was actually a simulated confetti parade for them. The Wizard of Oz gang, and people talk about shoujo being new for Western culture, which it is in part, but then there's like people like Judy Garland who did lead these hapless gay-like men through Oz to find their own agency and really affected culture. This is a notorious picture of James Dean and Tree. To me, it's kind of a quote of the Caravaggio painting called Love Triumphant, where you see the angel in a similar position with kind of vulnerable, saying, his anus, but also in the 70s, there was this photo that passed around of James Dean, or we think it's James Dean, in this pose. It could have been him because he was such a carefree spirit. This is my version of Ganymede. I love Rembrandt again, and this is actually from a Thomas Edison movie, where one of the first science fiction films where an eagle is saving this baby, bringing him to, Mount Olympus of culture. And really revering these people who really were able to change art, change the way that people thought. This is Anne Frank's room. Reminds me of Van Gogh's room, of course, but if you've ever gone to the Anne Frank house, it's incredible. And the feelings that you have there, I don't want to say ghosts, but there's definitely very mystical things that are going on in that room and that whole house in particular. And really, I'm half Jewish, my dad's Jewish, my mom's Southern Baptist, but I still regard myself as Jewish. And when she first moved in, she was putting in pictures of pop culture figures next to fine art figures. And she really wanted to be, hopeful and optimistic. I'm also thinking it's a little bit like a yellow wallpaper by looking at these revered figures to try to give her hope, to try to give her optimism when she was writing about, the Jews and the Holocaust, wanting other people to understand what was going on, wanting to be a great writer, and performing that by being a great writer before, of course, she sadly passed. This was called Friends and Family, and this was in Ohio. This is Matthew Shepard from a personal photo from one of his friends who had just recently been murdered. This is my 9/11 painting. Now, as I mentioned, I actually witnessed 9/11. It was really appalling, of course. We heard the planes fly overhead. We went onto the street. We saw the people in the building. I went to my NYU class. I said, oh my gosh, you guys, I don't know how to draw this or what to do about this, but everybody was in shock. Let's just go to Washington Square Park and draw it. And it was in the first moment that the first building fell and everybody screamed, but my kid's really good. And I was like hugging people and telling, and it's like, okay, guys, like, please go home and tell your parents that everything's okay. And my dad was in town too. And as I mentioned, like he gave me a photo to paint. I didn't want to do it, but after 7 years of having nightmares of people falling, I would, in my nightmare, reach out to them and being a John Lennon fan, say, all you need is love. To get rid of the nightmares, I did this painting. And my friends were like, oh my gosh, you can't show this, right? And I was like, no, I don't want to show it. I'm not doing it for that reason. And you can't sell it. And I was like, no, I would never want to sell it. But in fact, like I showed it in Ohio, it wasn't for sale. Nobody threw tomatoes at me. I put it in a group show and another show in New York, and it ended up going to the Whitney through a friend donating it, and it ended up in the inaugural show of the Whitney downtown as a history painting. And they were saying I'm kind of like a history painter, and that I'm sort of capturing these moments. And the really neat thing about this work was that it was bittersweet and sorrowful for me, and weird to have it up, honestly. But people were pointing at it and talking about it, crying. The best part was when parents would be showing their little kids the painting and pointing at it, telling the story, what happened, and having it be this locus where people could really talk about their feelings and bring about the life of what happened at that particular time, and having it work, hopefully in a positive way, as a history painting. Like this is an Anne Frank painting, and this actually ended up in the Cleveland Museum for a long time. And I was listening to her diaries and crying and trying to get across what it was I felt about her and her cultural import by doing this work. Elvis to lighten the mood a little bit. Muhammad Ali, who's such a dynamic figure in cultural history, not just in fighting history, but as you guys know, like world famous. And it's interesting because we don't think about that was Cassius Clay, and he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, and what an intense thing that was. How he was thrown out of sports for that, how he had to fight to make his comeback, which he did definitely. Katharine Hepburn, one of the first women to wear pantsuits, a lesbian as we find out now, and really dynamically changed culture. This is the planet from the Al Gore movie, but it's the first image of the Earth from space taken by a human being. Jackie Onassis also changed culture. Martin Luther King, done at the time of Katrina, actually for the Miami Art Fair, where I felt like he would never stop crying if he knew what had happened at that time. Another picture of King from the sit-ins. I started paying for my own photos at this particular moment. We're about to 2008 or so, and Ingrid Sishi invited me to cover the Haute Couture shows for what turned out to be her last issue of Interview. And I think she wanted me to be like Antonio Lopez, like a sketch artist. But I started taking pictures from my own film, from my own camera. The people would move around too much for me to actually capture them. And this was like a big moment for me because I realized that, OMG, like maybe through all these years, I could compose a good picture too. Instead of appropriating an image that I don't necessarily own in my own photo, maybe I can make my own paintings for my own photos, for my own memories of that particular moment. Here's Sophia Loren and Dita Von Teese at the Armani show, or Lagerfeld, who I actually got to meet, and or Valentino from his last show. These ended up being in the magazine, and then I continued to do them. Okay, this is when Obama had yet to become president. He was still debating Hillary Clinton, believe it or not. And I felt we needed good leaders because they were like an endangered species in a world that was a ship at sea. So that was the title of these shows, Good Leaders, Endangered Species, Ships at Sea. Of course, this is Martin Luther King and his family in a painting called Drum Majors from his favorite quote. James Dean again, sorry. Judy Garland again, sorry. Strong female protagonist. Elvis from my own photo near the Anne Frank house. Shirley Temple, who, despite her being a Republican, she was a good Republican, and the biggest star of her age, and really helped bring about awareness for breast cancer. And then whales, trying to do non-cheesy pictures of whales and non-cheesy pictures of maritime. This is an oil tanker that nearly was subsumed by this great wave but survived. A panda. I was like, oh my gosh, even if you were conservative and a Republican, don't you want to care about the endangered species? This is a Karmapa, the real Karmapa. I was getting into Buddhism a little bit, and he had to be rescued out of China to India in a trunk of a car, hence that scar on the side of his face. Tigers, like we love tigers. Like if only we could have more room for the tigers, and if conservatives could, realize like, oh my gosh, we need to save the tigers, then therefore maybe we need to save the planet and the air. And even though like this famous clipper ship, which was a merchant Courier and Ives print, maybe we can survive the rollicking sea of the Bush era and get into a better world. This was part 2 of Good Leaders, Endangered Species, Ships at Sea, this time in New York. And this was time of economic crisis, as you guys probably remember, in 2008. Obama hadn't become president yet, but I was glad, your invitation really starts with your show. Your show starts with your invitation, and we did a poster of this. And people, I like to think of the art world being sort of super lefty liberal, but they're not sometimes. And people called in Derek Eller and they said, please take my name off the mailing list forever, because they were McCain fans. I was really proud that this painting was up as the invitation for the show, but also in the foyer of the gallery during the time that he was actually elected president and became president. But again, endangered species, snow leopard, wine and break apart in abstraction. The Dalai Lama from my old photo at the Radio City Music Hall, thinking of it as kind of a giant mandala. This was a 9/11 triptych that I did after the 9/11 painting that ended up at the Corcoran, now at the American University, because the Corcoran's no more. Never had seen this photo of Falling Man because it was barred from New York audiences. But, really saying a prayer for each of these people as I was painting them, trying to commemorate them, trying to commemorate that moment. Also thinking of like nature in general, the sublime idea of nature, of like whales and, you know, in the sort of Bali High, you know, utopic world, or Alexander the Great. Yes, he was a bad colonizer, but he was at that time what we would perceive to be as gay, and he really respected all these different cultures. And thinking about the idea of heroism and what it is to be a good hero. I used to take my kids to Louise Bourgeois' studio when she was still alive from NYU. It'd be sort of like seeing Giacometti in France before he died in the 50s. And I asked her, I loved her because she made such great work that was so potent with meaning, but also psychology and feeling and form. And I asked her if I could take this picture of her, and she said yes. And so I was very honored to do this picture. Next in the next, Marx Brothers from Duck Soup. You know, this was allegorical for an anti-war movie done during the time of fascism, with the ridiculousness of war that we were still involved in. Next to Anne Frank. Next to my quote of a Duccio painting. You know, thinking about the magic world of somebody like this, a pre-Renaissance master, really thinking about his thoughts and having the images go into different worlds. And also El Greco, same thing. This is the opening of the Fifth Seal, a quote from the Met painting. And listening to the entire Bible on audio CD, Revelations gave me nightmares, like it should. Spoke from the voice of James Earl Jones, Darth Vader, but like a lot of other artists like Picasso and Pollock, really loving how in the unconscious space of negative space, there are like faces and forms that would emerge in this world. I'm going to zoom through. I realize we have 5 minutes left of official time. This was a drawing show at Casman. These were grad school drawings that they didn't take seriously in grad school, but if you just hold on to your own muse, grad students and undergrads, like, and just do your own thing, hopefully you'll come to the fore. And, you know, this was a very well-received show that was kind of like a mini retrospective of drawings of all the different ideas that I had at the time that I've been explaining to you, from the early stuff to the fashion paintings to Anne Frank to Obama. I was at NYU. They gave me the Broadway 8th Street show when they took over this space. And I realized, like, oh my gosh, like, I've been doing these chapters of these paintings that were part of my life, that maybe were part of a giant narrative called My American Dream. This is an important show for me called My Modern Life. Important because these were all images from my own photos of the Karmapa visiting the New York, of the theater show of Red, you know, thinking about ideas of Rothko, but also Warhol and the modernists. A picture of myself from my high school, what was going to be my high school yearbook, posing as a GQ model, but being secretly gay. My picture of Andrew at the Proust Room at the Ritz for our 40th birthdays, loving our moment, loving our life together. The Empire State Building, try to think about New York being strong and proud. The New Yorker building, thinking that like kind of like a King Kong building that was hopefully still standing strong. This was the corner of 9th and 36th Street, which seemed really forlorn at the time, but is now like a huge new multiplex structure. Here's me in front of the Proust painting, really thinking about those talismans and, you know, wanting to tell narratives like that. Andrew and I getting married the first Sunday you could at our cabin home, with our dear friend Dan marrying us in the background, our cabin home in Elsinore. You know, sometimes if you paint things, I don't believe necessarily in New Age stuff, but like maybe they'll come true. And fortunately, wonderfully, I was able to get this great job at USC after painting all these pictures of California from New York, really wishing that I could be back here. And it came and it happened. You know, and having like the garden fall into abstraction. And then this is a picture of the United States from Google Earth. You know, I had a dream like Jasper Johns painting the flag, of like painting a United States without borders. And then I realized that must be a good idea. And so I did this picture from Google Earth. I want to do a new version of this where it kind of goes into abstraction, but, you know, can't we get all along and can't we have a world without borders? I'm basically out of time. Nodler, before it closed, the good people of Nodler gave me a show, the Iconscapes, that nobody understood at the time, and I was so honored to have it at a show back in the place where it was all about that. More from Ohio, this is Art, Life, and Fashion of Andrew looking at the Obama debates when we were in Paris for the fashion shows, pictures of Amsterdam and Frank, Empire State Building, Times Square, wanting to make it come alive again. Andrew at the cabin picture, even though there were trailers and crystal meth labs, it was still our utopia where we felt all alone, but, you know, together and in a world at peace, you know. You know, this was, again, like I started putting these images together and thinking that each show was almost like a different chapter. And I love Walt Whitman and Leaves of Grass, and he would always add to it and subtract to it, but it was this grand narrative I'm still now doing that really began in the time of the Bush era that continues to today of My American Dream. Mixing in these iconscapes, these places that are really meaningful to me, pictures of Obama's family, next to pictures of my family, the Statue of Liberty, things breaking into abstraction that somehow cohere into figurization, James Dean's house, places of cultural value where people who were born, who really impacted culture through their art. Thinking about New York, the island of Manhattan, like being a ship that is like our ship of people, these iconscapes being like souls or spirits that are collected together in the world. This is Andrew and I as husbands. This is my family picture of my dad directing my cousin Deborah to take this picture of us watching our first color TV set. Andrew and I as kids, born at the same time. Superman, us in our heavenly abode in Elsinore. Annie Oakley, I was on the steps of the Met taking my comics kids to the kind of like comics tour of the Met. And I got the email that was in the biannual. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to repeat the mistakes of art history where I'm just doing pictures of rich white people and saying they're great. I really want to represent people of color, like Sitting Bull, women, people of different cultural value, even Kermit. And making that happen historically for me of this particular moment, of this particular time. This is my Whitney biannual show from 2014, where I was able to put almost like a coming attraction, this idea together, how everything fit. This is Obama, actually, this amazing moment where he actually came to the Whitney. This was actually by Pete Souza, of him looking at that painting, and supposedly he really had this moment in front of it. And I was able at Marlborough to put together all these images, and you can see a little bit of the big enchilada, all in this in less than 5 minutes, of the cosmology of My American Dream, just so you could see how it's growing and still growing today. This was later, just a couple of years ago, brought to the Cleveland Museum of Contemporary Art, MoCA. And I'm still working on this, from my own photos, pictures from Yosemite, pictures I took with my dear friend Dan, who died, of different cultural places, spaces, factories during the Trump era, trying to, talk about ideas of masculinity and what that can mean in the Trump era, trying to save what it is to be an American in this sad world. There's Trump and Nixon, which was sort of Elvis and Nixon, kind of like what Trump was. 3 Mile Island, pictures done, these iconscapes during Virginia during the egregiousness of Trump, the Pope looking forlorn here for good reason. This is interesting, the wind turbine blades in Texas that the conservatives are blaming the ice storms on, which is stupid. This is my last show at Marlborough on 57th Street called Heroes and Villain. And when I first came out of Brown, this was a blue chip gallery that was really meaningful to me. And I sort of was able to take it over right before basically they closed. I think I had more pictures of people of color. Here's sort of the Infinity Net picture of Obama looking at my 9/11 painting. And really thinking about, again, cultural heroes like my own Andrew, like Harriet Tubman, Moses, like the Christopher Street crew that helped to beget Stonewall, the Stonewall riots, trying to make that image come alive again. Liberty from my own photo, the Muppets again as cultural heroes, Bowie. There's a quote from a Titian St. Christopher painting where he's hopefully bringing goodwill between Niagara Falls, Yosemite and Washington, Batman, Wonder Woman, next to Jane Fonda, a real Wonder Woman, who's sort of pointing her guns at, here he is, Trump and Stormy. This is the thing that's probably going to bring Trump down. Maybe he'll actually get into prison because of Stormy. Stormy Daniels. I want to give her agency in here and power. Picture the Grand Canyon flag at half mast for the kids that died in the school shootings in Texas. This guy narrowly escaped out Rome, talking about his story. I wanted to do a picture of Emma Gonzalez from her 5 minutes from the March of Our Lives, where it was like Joan of Arc, but really remembering that potent moment that was more than performance art, and wanting to really, embrace the March for Our Lives kids. Robert Mueller, this icon that we were wishing upon that didn't come through, but Malcolm X who did. LeBron, who definitely is a cultural player beyond basketball to make the world a better place. Jim Acosta and the CNN holding their own against the Trump crowd. Andrew in front of the Empire State Building. Yosemite, hopefully it's not it's a heavenly place, hopefully not at the end of the world, taken on Christmas Day for my own photos. Elaine de Kooning, I'm sorry, I'm going to race through these from her studio. She was the leader of the pack of the AbX people. She helped to inspire Bill de Kooning to do abstraction. I'm doing my own abstraction here and going plein air at the Paula Krasner house, doing a picture of, you know, when Jackson Pollock seemed like a good guy, the Irascibles, trying to maybe make it political by doing a figurative painting of these great abstract painters, but really who are heroes, but at the same time, complicated heroes, with only one head of stern in the background. But there was Louise Bourgeois in this crew, a lot of really good people involved in this world. This is probably a good place to stop as I'm wondering about the future, thinking about my past, thinking about our future with Pelosi, thinking about the Trump people, fighting for the rights of power, fighting for democracy. It is precious. We need to, you know, keep fighting for it. You know, get beyond the Goya-esque black paintings of what Trump world begat and getting to our new future with Biden and Harris. Okay, with that, I'm going to stop, you guys. Thank you guys so much for your time and your patience. I'm sorry I'm 6 minutes over. If you have any questions, please let me know. I have drawings and more stuff to show you. I'm working for a show in the fall at Karma in New York City. I'm super excited about it. So please watch out for that. And you can follow me on Instagram. And anyway, I think we have about 3 minutes of questions, or maybe not. You guys, sorry, that was a lot. And I'm looking forward to talking to the grads. But look, you guys, if you're not a graduate student, I'm always happy to hear from you. I'm really grateful for this time to be able to espouse to you my work. It's a lot. I'm still going, but you know, it's kept me sane through this Trump era and all this time. The meditation and painting is hopefully what it's all about, making art that matters, making things that are meaningful. Hopefully in our humble place, we could, you know, help the world a little bit, but also help ourselves by making this work and sharing it with the world. What you guys do is important. If you're students, please keep going on. Like the Olympics, you know, they always say, never give up, but don't give up. Just keep going and, you know, make art because it's meaningful to you. Or if you're not an artist, every parade needs the people clapping for the floats. Keep supporting art. It's so important. And it proves that we're a great democracy and critical thinkers.
Keith, let me ask you a couple questions before we run out of time.
Yes.
So we have a question from Jess about work-life soul balance. And just the amount, how prolific you are has struck her. And I think that's a good question is, how do you convince yourself that the work you're making is enough work?
Well, look, you know, I am a son of a psychoanalyst. I really believe in the power of art, not just for the world, but also for ourselves. And I always tell the kids, you know, if I'm not teaching, which I love, and I always think art teaching is an extension of our art, and great artists teach, like we all know in the tradition of Southern California. But if I'm not teaching, if I'm not doing art world things, I'm painting or I'm drawing. It's just what I need to do. It's kind of like if you're an Olympian and you just need to work out all the time because it makes you feel good. It makes me feel good. I always believe in challenging myself. I always think to be a great artist, every piece you do needs to be your masterpiece, but then each new piece has to beat your masterpiece. And then you could get to be really old and have ice cream and die like Louise Bourgeois, you know, making your best work at the end of your life after a great, you know, challenge of challenging yourself throughout your work, throughout your life, making art that matters. And if it's meaningful to you, it's like brain yoga because you could ruminate upon its meaning while you're doing it. And as the puzzles in your mind are sort of figuring out in the puzzles of your composition, sometimes you have epiphanies and it makes you feel good and it's edifying and you have something to prove for your thoughts. This work that will hopefully bring you pleasure and thought, but hopefully other people too.
So let me ask you one more question about that. It's really
Sure.
inspiring. Do you ever throw any work away? Do you ever make a painting and decide it's not good enough, you're going to toss it? Or do you feel like every painting that you make is one of your thoughts and so it has to live somewhere in the archive?
No, I don't show all of them. I do have some closets full of works, I'll tell you, and so on, but I'm trying to get better at editing. but I never want to throw anything away. I don't want to paint over things. Other people have, torn apart their paintings or painted over them, but you never know. Like, I think we're good, hopefully, all of our lives. And the stuff you made when you were 12 is just as good as the stuff you make when you're 20, as good as the stuff you make when you're 80. And it's a document of time. It is like a diary, but it's an aesthetic diary of ideas. So I don't want to throw it away. I want to, I love art. It's kind of like your spirit, I'm not a religious person, as I mentioned, but what are we? We are minds, or we are bodies? And what is the thing that gives a life a work of its own? Maybe it's your spirit. Maybe it's the soulful intentions of who and what and where you are and what you're thinking that helps to bring life to work. And I don't want to throw that away.
So we have 2 more questions, and I'm just going to hold the floor so we can ask them.
Sure.
One is about your use of salon style hanging, why you put and how you put the arrangements on the wall that you put, and how you choose your arrangement, your narrative. So you mentioned understanding comics, but maybe could you speak to that a little bit more, kind of salon installation,
well,
how you relate images?
I always think about composition and juxtaposition, being a semiotics guy, but also a comics guy from early age. And I do think of salon style as being like giant compositions, and people don't necessarily consciously think about that now. But of course, when you go to churches and you see the walls and frescoes, and I love Thomas Hart Benton and Orozco and all Diego Rivera and all the great Mexican muralists and so on. And they're really thinking about juxtaposing different panels of images. Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling is one of those things, kind of like a comic. Instead of having one character go through all the different panels like Little Nemo, maybe you have different characters going through different things, but hopefully the way you juxtapose them, and even the space between panels is really important teaching comics. Those are like the gutter. I think like understanding comics, like the space between you and the image is sort of the closure where you're hopefully seduced by the image to think about in your own way too. But then when you have one painting next to another painting or drawing, with the sequence of how you see things helps in a metonymic way to tell a vertical narrative. When you have everything in the cosmology, it's kind of like a vertical narrative. You might lose the agency or the presences of one particular painting, but then you get the whole world of them. Before I go to sleep at night, instead of counting sheep when I have shows, I think this will go next to this, this will go next to this, this will go next to this. No, wait, strike that. This will go next to this. Then I Photoshop it. And I tell my dealers, like, oh my gosh, you guys, like I'm an installation artist that works with pictures. The big ones don't just go in the big room, the small ones in the small room. For me, it really matters. But I go in there and knowing exactly how it goes. It takes just an afternoon to place things because it's just basically about moving them an inch or two this way or that. But basically it's figured out. And I really want, even though consciously people don't necessarily know that my stories are nonlinear narratives of installations, they do get this feeling. Like the best thing that happens is when people are like, like I saw your show and made me feel weird, but it made me think about stuff. And like, why'd you juxtapose this next to that? But it made me start thinking about stuff. I'm like, yes, it's like a dream sequence in a movie. It's like a poem, but it's a visual one. It's a comic.
And it's a semiotic activity is what you're describing too. I mean, it's so
Absolutely.
telling that that's your background. Really interesting. And then our last question, if you wouldn't mind addressing it maybe quickly, just because we're running out of time, but I think it's a really good one and also follows on a conversation that Jenny Lynn and I have been having around her own writing, which is the question of fandom. So, there's a lot of humor in your work, which is wonderful. And there's also a lot of affection and fandom in your work. And so this questioner is asking, how do you battle the quote disdain, unquote, the traditional art has with fan works?
I'm over it because like the high-low thing was supposed to be over even when Kurt Vonnegut did his infamous show at MoMA back in the
like with Alloway, right? In 1960?
Yeah. And like, I grew up in Colorado. It has way better museums than it did I appreciate also what it had when I was growing up. But my access to art was through comics. It was through pop culture. Like, and I love the Muppets, not just because they were like campy, but because they gave me a models for being. Like Miss Piggy is like a drag queen, and Kermit's kind of queer. But they were like really good fuzzy characters that you can identify with that were about really good ideology of working together, cooperation, making the world a better place. And like this stuff that's like in our world doesn't need to be just comics for kids or anything like that. Like comics, and one of the reasons I teach comics and starting the narrative art program at USC are art for the world. Mm-hmm. And I love anything that's really helping to make the world a better place and identifying with it in the same way that when you're a little kid, you're reading a comic, becoming Snoopy. I'm looking at these images. I want to reinsert the idea of myself masking into that character, having them be an avatar, and honor them, not as a history painting of cultural history, but also to bring life to it too. Like I think, Warhol and pop art, they sort of posted stamps of these characters, which was appropriate. If postmodernity is about agency being reified in the capital, they were doing that in their work. And yet those people were human beings. Human beings can change the world. I'm a hippie at heart. We could change the world through our art. And I want to pay homage to those people who really helped to do that as models for myself and also other people, like that we know that we're all in this together, whether it's high or low. It's a kumbaya of aesthetics and ideas, and we need to get together and bring our work to the world, especially now, in order for it to survive, for democracy to survive, for our planet to survive. It's important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Keith. That's so inspiring. Let's stop there. Thanks everybody for joining us. Please come back next week for Carmen Winnett. And if you are going to be joining the graduate seminar, then we'll take 5 and we'll reconvene at the other link at 3:20. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you guys for your patience. Kumbaya, everybody. Good luck. Keep making art, and talk to you guys soon. Throw me a line. I'm on Instagram. My great honor to be here. Thanks, guys.